The Henderson farmhouse stood like a solitary tooth in the vast, empty gums of the Nebraska plains. Built in 1887, it had witnessed generations of the same family toil against the unforgiving land. Margaret Henderson, now 59, had inherited the property 20 years ago when her parents died within months of each other. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, the closest town 15. This isolation had never bothered Margaret until recently. She sat at her weathered kitchen table, the morning light casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that had begun peeling at the edges. Her hands, once smooth and delicate, now bore the calluses and liver spots of decades of hard work. Outside, the autumn wind whistled through the gaps in the window frames, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. Margaret stared at the pregnancy test on the table before her, the 2 pink lines as stark and undeniable as the horizon outside her window. Her mind reeled with disbelief. At 59, postmenopausal for nearly a decade, this was biologically impossible. Yet here was the evidence, mocking her with its implications. "Richard will be back from the field soon," she whispered to herself, her voice sounding foreign in the empty kitchen. Richard, the boy she had taken in 20 years ago when he was just 12, the son of her cousin who had died in a car accident. Richard, whom she had raised as her own son. Richard, who, now at 32, worked the farm alongside her. Richard, who had started looking at her differently 6 months ago. The memory of their first encounter flooded back. It had been a stormy April night. The power had gone out, and they had huddled by the fireplace for warmth and light. The bourbon had flowed freely, dissolving boundaries that should have remained solid. What happened afterward was a blur of misplaced passion and desperate loneliness. A terrible mistake that had somehow continued, evolved into something routine yet unspoken. The sound of tires on gravel jolted her back to the present. Richard's truck. She quickly swept the pregnancy test into her apron pocket just as the screen door creaked open. "Storm's coming," Richard said, hanging his worn baseball cap on the hook by the door. His face, tanned from working outdoors, showed no signs of the secret they shared. "Got the Southfield finished just in time." Margaret nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Dinner's almost ready," she managed, turning to stir a pot of stew that had been simmering all afternoon. Richard crossed the kitchen, placing a hand on the small of her back as he peered into the pot. "Smells good, Ma," he said, the term of endearment now twisted with their shared transgression. As they ate in silence, the walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in around Margaret. The impossibility of her condition, the wrongness of their relationship, the isolation that had fostered this aberration, it all pressed down on her like the gathering storm clouds outside. "Everything all right?" Richard asked, noticing her untouched meal. Margaret forced a smile. "Just tired," she replied. But as the first raindrops began to pelt the roof, she knew that soon she would have to tell him the impossible truth. And she feared what might happen when she did. The rain continued for 3 days, turning the dirt roads to mud, and effectively cutting off the farmhouse from the outside world. Margaret spent these days in a daze, mechanically performing her chores, while her mind grappled with her impossible condition. She avoided Richard as much as the confined space would allow, making excuses about headaches and fatigue. On the 4th morning, as pale sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Margaret was retching into the toilet when a knock came at the bathroom door. "You okay in there, Ma?" Richard's voice carried concern, but there was something else too, a possessiveness that had been growing since their relationship changed. "Fine," she called back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Must be something I ate." When she emerged, Richard was standing in the hallway, his tall frame blocking her path. His eyes, the same deep brown as his mother's had been, studied her face. "You're not fine," he said simply. "You've been avoiding me." Margaret tried to step around him, but he moved with her, maintaining the blockade. "I need to start breakfast," she muttered, looking at the floor, the walls, anywhere but at him. "No," Richard said, his voice soft but firm. "We need to talk about what's happening here." The weight of those words hung between them. What was happening here? A lifetime of proper boundaries crossed, a maternal relationship perverted, an impossible pregnancy at 59. How could any of this be discussed in daylight, outside the strange nocturnal reality where their transgression lived? "There's nothing to talk about," Margaret insisted, finally meeting his gaze with a hardness she didn't feel. "What happened? What's been happening? It needs to stop." Something flickered across Richard's face, hurt, anger, perhaps both. "You didn't say that last week," he said, his voice low. "Or the week before." Margaret felt her face flush with shame. He was right. She had been a willing participant in their sin, had even initiated some of their encounters in moments of unbearable loneliness. The isolation of the farm, the years of having no one but each other, these weren't excuses, but they were the fertile ground in which this perversion had taken root. I'm saying it now, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. It was wrong from the start. I was supposed to be your mother. Richard's jaw tightened. You're not my mother, he said, the words cutting through her like a blade. You're my cousin's wife who took me in. We're not even blood related. The technicality he clung to disgusted her, not least because she had used the same rationalization during their darkest moments together. I raised you, Margaret said, her voice breaking. I packed your school lunches. I taught you to drive in that old pickup. I held you when you cried over girls who broke your heart. Richard stepped closer, his familiar scent, soap, hay, and the underlying musk that was uniquely him, enveloping her. And now we're something else, he whispered. Something more. Margaret felt the pregnancy test in her pocket like a hot coal against her thigh. She needed to tell him, but not like this. Not when he was looking at her with that hungry expression that both repelled and, God help her, still attracted her. I need time, she said, finally pushing past him. Please, Richard. Just give me some space. He let her go, but as she hurried down the hallway, his voice followed her. We're all we've got, Ma. There's nobody else out here who understands. In the kitchen, Margaret gripped the counter as another wave of nausea hit her. He was right about one thing. They were isolated, alone together on this farm that had become both their haven and their prison, and soon, impossibly, there would be three of them. A week passed, then another. Margaret managed to hide her morning sickness by rising before dawn, emptying her stomach quietly while Richard still slept. Their interactions became strained, formal, as if they were actors playing the roles of mother and son again after forgetting their lines for months. Richard respected her request for space, though his eyes followed her constantly, questioning, waiting. The changes in her body, subtle but undeniable, terrified Margaret. Her breasts felt tender, her abdomen bloated. The impossible was happening inside her, a cruel biological joke on a woman who should have been well past childbearing years. She needed medical confirmation, but the thought of driving to Dr. Patterson in town, of explaining her situation to someone who had known her for decades, was unthinkable. One afternoon, while Richard was repairing fencing in the north pasture, Margaret gathered her courage and called the clinic in Lincoln, 2 hours away. She made an appointment for the following week, giving a false name, inventing a story about visiting her sister. As she hung up, she heard the crunch of boots on the porch steps. Richard entered, earlier than expected, his shirt dark with sweat. Finish the fence, he said, then paused, noticing the phone in her hand. Who were you calling? Just checking on a seed order, Margaret lied, turning away to put on water for coffee. They're backed up with all the rain delays. Richard made a non-committal sound. He crossed to the sink to wash his hands, standing closer to her than necessary. I miss you, he said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of accusation. Margaret kept her eyes on the kettle. Richard, we talked about this. No, you talked. I listened. He dried his hands slowly on the dish towel. But this thing between us isn't just going to disappear because you've decided it should. Margaret felt a flash of anger. This thing between us should never have started, she snapped. It was wrong, Richard. On every level. It didn't feel wrong, he countered, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. It felt like something that had been building for years. You felt it too. Margaret closed her eyes, willing herself not to remember the comfort of his touch. The relief of intimacy after so many years of loneliness. It doesn't matter what I felt, she said. What matters is what's right. Richard laughed, a bitter sound. Right, out here. Who decides what's right when there's no one around for miles? The kettle began to whistle, and Margaret seized the excuse to move away from him. As she did, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The room spun, darkened at the edges. She staggered, reaching for the counter but missing. Strong arms caught her before she hit the floor. Richard's face swam above her, concern replacing the earlier intensity. Ma? Margaret, what's wrong? She tried to speak, but another spell of dizziness overwhelmed her. Richard carried her to the living room sofa, laying her down gently. He disappeared and returned with a glass of water, holding it to her lips. You need to see a doctor, he said, all traces of their earlier argument gone, replaced by genuine worry. Margaret took small sips, the dizziness gradually subsiding. I'm fine, she insisted. Just got up too fast. Richard's eyes narrowed, studying her face. You've been fine a lot lately. The headaches, the fatigue, now this. His gaze traveled down to her abdomen, then back to her face, a question forming. It's just age, Margaret said quickly. Women my age have ... issues. But Richard was already shaking his head, the puzzle pieces fitting together in his mind. No, he said slowly. That's not it. He disappeared again, returning moments later with her purse. Before she could protest, he dumped its contents onto the coffee table, rummaging through lipsticks, keys, receipts, and then stopped, holding up an empty box. the pregnancy test box she had forgotten to dispose of properly. Their eyes met over this damning evidence, the impossible truth hovering between them. "Is it mine?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. The absurdity of the question, who else could it possibly be, struck Margaret like a physical blow. The situation, bizarre and wrong as it was, suddenly seemed darkly comical. A laugh escaped her, high-pitched and verging on hysteria. Richard's expression hardened. "Answer me," he demanded, his fingers tightening around the empty box until it crumpled. "Are you pregnant with my child?" The laughter died in Margaret's throat. "It's impossible," she whispered. "I'm 59, Richard. I haven't had a period in years." "But you took the test," he persisted, gesturing at the crushed box. "What did it say?" Margaret closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear into the worn cushions of the sofa. "Positive," she admitted, "but it has to be a mistake. Some sort of false positive. That's why I made an appointment in Lincoln, to confirm." Richard was silent for so long that Margaret finally opened her eyes. He was staring at her midsection, his expression unreadable. "You were going to Lincoln without telling me?" he finally asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I needed to know for sure before ... quotes Margaret trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Before what?" Richard demanded. "Before you decided what to do without me?" The possessiveness in his tone sent a chill through Margaret. This was why she hadn't told him, this proprietary attitude toward her body, toward what might be growing inside her. "Richard," she said carefully, "even if this is real, and I don't believe it is, we have to acknowledge how wrong this situation is." "Wrong?" He stood suddenly, towering over her. "What's wrong is you hiding this from me? What's wrong is you making decisions about my child without me, his child?" The words hung in the air, making the impossible situation suddenly terribly concrete. Margaret struggled to sit up, feeling vulnerable lying down while he loomed over her. "If I am somehow miraculously pregnant at my age," she said, fighting to keep her voice calm, "then we have some very difficult decisions to make." Together, she added, seeing the storm brewing in his eyes. "But first I need medical confirmation." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then abruptly turned and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Margaret called after him. "To finish my work," he replied without looking back. "And to think about our future." The door slammed behind him, leaving Margaret alone with the scattered contents of her purse and the terrible knowledge that her impossible secret was no longer hers alone. The morning of her appointment in Lincoln dawned cold and gray. Margaret had barely slept, her mind cycling through scenarios, each more distressing than the last. Richard had been distant since discovering the pregnancy test, speaking to her only when necessary, watching her with those dark, knowing eyes. The fragile peace between them felt like a frozen pond in late winter. One wrong step and they would both plunge into icy depths. She dressed carefully in her good navy skirt and a loose blouse, applied lipstick with a shaking hand. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman trying desperately to appear normal, dignified, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. In the kitchen, she found Richard already at the table, fully dressed, car keys beside his coffee mug. "I'll drive you," he said simply. Margaret stood in the doorway, caught off guard. "That's not necessary," she began, but Richard cut her off. "It's not a request," he said, his tone flat. "I'm coming with you." Margaret felt her heart rate accelerate. She had planned to use this appointment not just for confirmation of her condition, but also to discuss options she suspected Richard wouldn't want to consider. "The roads are still bad after the rain," he continued, mistaking her hesitation. "And you've been dizzy. It's not safe for you to drive alone." His concern seemed genuine, which only complicated matters. Despite everything, Richard did care for her, in his way. The problem was that his care had mutated into something possessive, something that blurred all the boundaries she had once maintained so carefully. "All right," Margaret conceded, knowing that refusing would only escalate tensions. "But you'll wait in the car. Doctor-patient confidentiality is important." A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw, but he nodded. "Fine. But afterward we talk. Really talk." The drive to Lincoln stretched for 2 hours of tense silence. The radio played softly, an oldie station that normally would have had them both singing along, a shared love of music being one of their few uncomplicated connections. Today neither made a sound as Buddy Holly, then the Everly Brothers, then Elvis filled the empty space between them. The clinic was in a nondescript medical building on the outskirts of Lincoln. As promised, Richard remained in the car, though the look he gave her as she exited spoke volumes. "Don't betray me," his eyes seemed to say. Though what betrayal meant in this context, Margaret wasn't sure. The waiting room was mercifully quiet, just a young couple and an elderly man with his middle-aged daughter. Margaret kept her eyes on a tattered copy of Better Homes and Gardens. Avoiding eye contact, feeling as though her shame must be visible to everyone present. Margaret Smith, a nurse called the false name she had given, and Margaret rose, following her through sterile hallways to an examination room. Dr. Winters was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Margaret immediately appreciated. "So, Miss Smith," she began, consulting her clipboard, "you believe you might be pregnant?" Margaret nodded, her mouth dry. "Yes, but it's impossible. I'm 59 postmenopausal for years, doctor." Winters looked up, clearly surprised by this information. "I see. And you've taken a home pregnancy test?" "Positive," Margaret confirmed. "But there must be some mistake. Some other explanation." The doctor set down her clipboard. "Pregnancy after menopause is extremely rare, but not entirely unprecedented," she said carefully. "There are documented cases of women in their 50s, and very occasionally early 60s, conceiving naturally, though it's often associated with certain medical conditions." Hope flickered in Margaret. Perhaps there was a medical explanation, something that would make this all a terrible misunderstanding. "We'll run a blood test to confirm, doctor." Winters continued, "And if it's positive, I'd recommend an immediate ultrasound to assess viability and rule out other conditions that can cause false positives in older women." The examination proceeded with clinical efficiency. Blood was drawn, questions asked about Margaret's medical history, her last period at least 8 years ago, and her sexual activity. At this last question, Margaret hesitated, then gave vague answers about a recent relationship, avoiding any details that might raise eyebrows. "It will take about 30 minutes for the blood test results," Dr. Winters informed her. "You can wait in the examination room if you'd prefer privacy." Left alone, Margaret sat on the paper-covered examination table, her mind racing. Outside the small window, she could see a slice of the parking lot, including Richard's truck. He was still there, waiting. What was he thinking? What was he planning? The 30 minutes crawled by, each second stretching interminably. When Dr. Winters finally returned, her expression was professionally neutral, but there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Ms. Smith," she said, closing the door firmly behind her, "the blood test confirms that you are indeed pregnant." Despite having suspected this outcome, the confirmation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the examination table, her knuckles white. "This is highly unusual for a woman of your age," Dr. Winters continued, watching her reaction carefully. "I'd like to perform an ultrasound immediately to check for viability and rule out ectopic pregnancy, which would be dangerous." Margaret nodded numbly, unable to speak. The doctor left briefly, returning with an ultrasound machine. The cold gel on Margaret's abdomen, the pressure of the wand, the doctor's concentrated expression, it all seemed to be happening to someone else. Some other woman whose life hadn't spiraled into this impossible scenario. "There," Dr. Winters said finally, turning the screen toward Margaret. "You can see the gestational sac and yolk sac here. Based on this, I'd estimate you're about 7 weeks along." Margaret stared at the grainy image, unable to reconcile the small smudge on the screen with her reality. 7 weeks. That would place conception in late August, during that heat wave when the air conditioning had broken, when they had slept with the windows open, when Richard had come to her room in the middle of the night. "Miss Smith," Dr. Winters' voice broke through her thoughts, "I need to be very clear with you. This pregnancy carries significant risks at your age. The chances of chromosomal abnormalities are high. There are also considerable risks to your health: hypertension, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, hemorrhage." Margaret nodded again, still staring at the screen. "Additionally," the doctor continued, her voice gentler now, "I want you to know that you have options. Given the risks involved, termination would be a reasonable medical choice in this situation." At the word termination, Margaret finally found her voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I think that would be best." Dr. Winters nodded, her expression compassionate. "We can discuss the procedures available to you and the timing. Nebraska law allows for abortion up to 12 weeks, so you still have time to consider your decision carefully." As the doctor outlined the options: medication abortion versus surgical procedures, timing, aftercare, Margaret's thoughts returned to Richard waiting in the car. How would he react to her decision? The possessiveness he had already displayed, the way he had claimed this impossible child as his. She suddenly felt afraid in a way she hadn't before. "Dr. Winters," she interrupted, "is it possible to have the procedure today? Now?" The doctor looked surprised. "No, I'm afraid not. There's a 24-hour waiting period required by state law, and you would need to schedule with a provider who performs the procedure. The earliest would likely be next week." Margaret felt a wave of despair. A week of living with Richard, of navigating his expectations, his claims on her body. "Is everything all right, Miss Smith?" Dr. Winters asked, noticing her distress. Is there someone pressuring you about this pregnancy? The concern in the doctor's voice nearly broke Margaret's carefully maintained composure. How could she possibly explain her situation? That the father of this impossible pregnancy was the man she had raised as her son? That she feared his reaction to her decision? No, Margaret lied, gathering her strength. I'm just overwhelmed. It's a lot to process. Dr. Winters studied her face. If you're in any kind of difficult situation, if you feel unsafe or pressured, there are resources available to help you. For a brief moment, Margaret considered telling the truth. Imagined the relief of confessing, of asking for help to escape the isolated farmhouse and the relationship that had festered there. But the shame was too great, the potential consequences too overwhelming. Thank you, she said instead. I'm fine. Just shocked by all this. Dr. Winters didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. I'll write down some contact information for you, clinics that provide the services we discussed, as well as counseling resources. She hesitated, then added, and a number for a women's shelter, just in case you ever need it. Margaret took the papers with trembling hands, folding them carefully and tucking them into her purse. As she prepared to leave, Dr. Winters placed a hand on her arm. Miss Smith, whatever you decide, please take care of yourself. And remember that you can call us if you need anything at all. The kindness in her voice made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. She nodded quickly and hurried out, afraid that if she stayed a moment longer she might break down completely. In the parking lot, Richard straightened as he saw her approaching. He got out of the truck, meeting her halfway. Well, he asked, his voice tense. Margaret looked into his face, the face she had watched grow from a boy's to a man's, the face that had looked to her for guidance, for approval, for love. Now it looked at her with an expectation she couldn't fulfill. We need to talk, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But not here. Let's go home first. Richard's eyes searched hers, trying to read the verdict. You are, aren't you? He said quietly. You're pregnant. Margaret nodded once, unable to deny the medical confirmation. A smile spread across Richard's face, transforming it. He reached for her as if to embrace her, but Margaret stepped back. Not here, she repeated more firmly, and there's a lot we need to discuss. The smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. Richard's gaze hardened, but he nodded, opening the passenger door for her with exaggerated politeness. As they drove away from Lincoln, back toward the isolated farmhouse, Margaret clutched her purse containing Dr. Winters' information. The papers inside represented a lifeline, a way out of this impossible situation. But as the city receded behind them and the empty plains stretched ahead, she wondered if she would have the courage to use it, and what would happen if she did. The farmhouse appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the late afternoon heat. The drive back from Lincoln had been silent, tension crackling between them like static electricity before a storm. Margaret had spent the journey rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain her decision, but as they pulled into the dusty driveway, all her prepared words evaporated. Richard killed the engine but made no move to exit the truck. Tell me what the doctor said, he demanded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. All of it. Margaret took a deep breath. The pregnancy is confirmed, she began, keeping her voice as steady as possible. I'm about 7 weeks along. But, Richard, there are serious risks involved. At my age, the chances of complications are extremely high, for me and for the fetus. She deliberately avoided the word baby, trying to maintain clinical distance to frame this as a medical situation rather than an emotional one. Did they do an ultrasound? Richard asked, ignoring her warnings. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Did you see it? Our baby? The possessive pronoun hung in the air between them. It's not a baby yet, Richard, Margaret said gently. Just a small collection of cells. And yes, there are serious abnormality risks due to my age. Richard finally turned to look at her, his expression hardening. What else did the doctor say? What aren't you telling me? Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her purse, where Dr. Winters' information was hidden. She said carefully. Given the risks, she suggested that termination would be the safest. No. The word came out like a gunshot. Absolutely not. Richard, please listen. No. He slammed his hand against the dashboard, making Margaret flinch. You're not killing our child. I won't let you. The violence in his voice and his posture confirmed Margaret's worst fears. She reached for the door handle, suddenly desperate to be out of the confined space. This isn't your decision to make, she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite her racing heart. It's my body, my health at risk. Richard grabbed her arm as she attempted to exit, his grip painfully tight. It's my child too, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Mine. Do you understand? I'm not letting you take this away from me. Fear bloomed in Margaret's chest, not just of Richard's anger, but of the possessiveness behind it. This wasn't just about the pregnancy, it was about control. She'd seen glimpses of this side of Richard before, in the way he monitored her phone calls, questioned her rare trips to town, discouraged visitors. The isolation that had seemed like simple rural living now revealed itself as something more deliberate, more sinister. "You're hurting me," she said quietly, looking pointedly at his hand on her arm. Richard released her immediately, looking momentarily ashamed. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I didn't mean to. I'm just upset." "You have to understand, Ma, this is a miracle, a gift." The tenderness with which he said Ma, the old term of endearment now twisted by their relationship, made Margaret's stomach turn. She pushed the truck door open and stepped out into the yard, needing space, air. Richard followed, his long strides easily catching up to her as she headed for the house. "We need to finish this conversation," he insisted. Inside, Margaret went straight to the kitchen, putting the solid wooden table between them. "Richard," she began again, summoning her most authoritative voice, the one she had used when he was a defiant teenager. "I understand you're upset, but you need to understand the reality of this situation. I'm 59 years old. The risks of carrying this pregnancy to term are enormous. We'll get the best doctors," Richard countered. "We'll move closer to a hospital if we need to. Whatever it takes." "It's not just about medical care," Margaret pressed on. "Think about what this child's life would be like. I'd be nearly 80 by the time they graduated high school. And you, double quotes." She hesitated, struggling with how to address the fundamental wrongness of their relationship. "I would be their father," Richard said firmly. "A good father. And what would we tell them about me?" Margaret challenged. "About us? About how they came to be? The truth would destroy them, and a lie would destroy us." Richard paced the kitchen, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "We could move," he suggested. "Start fresh somewhere no one knows us. Say we're husband and wife." The casualness with which he proposed this fiction horrified Margaret. "And live a lie forever? That's your solution?" "It's not a lie," Richard shouted, slamming his palm down on the table. "Not anymore. What we have is real, Margaret. It's changed. You know it has." "And what we have is wrong," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "It was wrong from the start, and this pregnancy doesn't make it right. It makes it worse." Richard's expression darkened. "So that's it? You've made up your mind without even discussing it with me? You're going to kill our baby and pretend none of this ever happened?" The cruel simplification of her position angered Margaret. "I'm trying to make the best decision in an impossible situation," she said. "For all of us. Including you, Richard. This isn't the life you should have. You should be with someone your own age, starting a normal family. Don't tell me what I should want." Richard interrupted, his voice rising again. "I've spent my life being told what I should want, what I should do. The good foster son. The responsible farm boy. Well, I know what I want now, and it's you, and it's our child." His intensity frightened her. Margaret had always known Richard had a temper, had seen flashes of it over the years when machinery broke down or crops failed, but she had never before felt it directed at her with such force. "Richard," she said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite her fear, "I've made an appointment for next week, in Lincoln. I've made my decision." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. Richard stared at her as if seeing a stranger. "No," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "No, you haven't." He moved suddenly, crossing to the counter where her purse lay. Before she could react, he had appended it, scattering its contents across the countertop. He snatched up Dr. Winter's papers, scanning them quickly. "This is it?" he demanded, waving the clinic information. "This is where you plan to do it?" Margaret lunged for the papers, but Richard held them out of reach. "Give those back," she demanded. "They're private." Instead, Richard crumpled the papers in his fist and strode to the old wood stove in the corner of the kitchen. He lifted the iron lid and dropped the crumpled ball inside onto the embers that were always kept going during the colder months. The papers caught immediately, curling into ash. "No appointment," he said flatly, replacing the stove lid. "No discussion. You're having this baby, Margaret. Our baby." The finality in his voice, the deliberate destruction of her lifeline, sent ice through Margaret's veins. She had never truly feared Richard before this moment, but now she saw something in his eyes she didn't recognize, something primitive and possessive that would not be reasoned with. "You can't keep me prisoner here," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "You can't force me to carry this pregnancy." Richard's expression softened slightly, but the determination in his eyes remained. "I don't want to force you to do anything, Ma," he said, the endearment sending another chill through her. "I just want you to think about this. Really think. This is our chance for a real family, something neither of us ever had properly. Can't you see that?" His ability to shift from threatening to pleading disturbed Margaret almost more than his anger had. It spoke of an emotional instability she hadn't fully recognized until now. "I need some air," she said, unable to continue the conversation. "Please, Richard. Just give me some space." To her surprise, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. At the door, however, he spoke again. "I've called Joe to come help with the harvest next week. I canceled his motel reservation in town. Told him we'd put him up here. He'll be staying in the guest room." Margaret turned, confused by this apparent non sequitur. "What does that have to do with anything?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just thought you should know we'll have company. Might make it hard for you to sneak off to Lincoln for any ... appointments." The calculated nature of this move, ensuring she wouldn't be alone, couldn't take the truck without explanation, stunned Margaret. How long had he suspected? How carefully had he been watching her? "You're controlling me," she said, the reality of her situation suddenly crystallizing. "You have been for a while, haven't you?" Richard shrugged, not denying it. "I'm protecting what's mine," he said simply. "What's ours?" Margaret stepped outside, her legs unsteady beneath her. The vast emptiness of the Nebraska plains, once comforting in its familiarity, now seemed like an insurmountable barrier between her and help. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the phone landline could be monitored, and now Richard was ensuring she wouldn't be left alone. As the screen door banged shut behind her, Margaret faced the terrifying reality that the farmhouse that had been her home for decades had become her prison. And Richard, the boy she had raised with love and care, had become her jailer. Darkness came early in October, sweeping across the plains like a tide. Margaret sat on the porch swing, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. She had been outside for hours, unable to face Richard after their confrontation, unable to go back into the house that now felt like a trap. The temperature dropped rapidly with the sun, and Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She would have to go in eventually. The nights were too cold to stay out, but for now, the discomfort was preferable to what awaited her inside. The screen door creaked, and Richard's silhouette appeared in the doorway. "Dinner's ready," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I made your favorite, pot roast." The normality he was attempting to project after their earlier confrontation struck Margaret as obscene, as if they were still just mother and son, as if he hadn't threatened to keep her prisoner to force her to carry his child. "I'm not hungry," she replied, keeping her eyes on the darkening fields. Richard sighed audibly. "You need to eat, Ma, for the baby." The manipulation in those words, invoking concern for her health only in service of the pregnancy, hardened something in Margaret. She stood up from the swing. "Fine," she said, brushing past him into the house. "I'll eat. But don't pretend this is normal, Richard. Don't pretend you're not holding me hostage." In the kitchen, Richard had indeed prepared her favorite meal. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh rolls on the side. He had even set the table with the good plates, the ones they used only for holidays. The domesticity of the scene contrasted sharply with the reality of their situation. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Margaret forced herself to eat, though each bite tasted like ash. She needed her strength if she was going to find a way out of this situation. "I've been thinking," Richard said finally, breaking the silence, "about names. If it's a boy, I like the name Thomas, after your father. For a girl, maybe Elizabeth, after my mother." Margaret set down her fork with deliberate care. "There won't be a baby to name, Richard." His face darkened. "We've been through this. You're having this baby, and if I refuse?" Margaret challenged, meeting his gaze directly. "What then? Will you tie me to the bed? Force feed me? Keep me locked up for 9 months? Richard looked genuinely shocked at the suggestion. "Of course not. I would never hurt you." "You already are hurting me," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "By trying to control me, by not respecting my decision about my own body." "It's not just your body anymore," Richard insisted. "It's our child's body, too. A collection of cells," Margaret corrected. "Not a child. Not yet." Richard pushed his plate away, appetite apparently gone. "I saw your face when you came out of that clinic," he said. "You saw something on that ultrasound." Something real. Margaret couldn't deny it. There had been a moment, looking at that grainy image, when the reality of what was growing inside her had hit home. But that moment of connection didn't change the fundamental wrongness of the situation. "Even if I wanted this child," she said carefully, "which I don't, the risks at my age are enormous." The doctor made that very clear. "Women have babies in their 50s all the time now," Richard countered. "Even older, with fertility treatments." "Not in their late 50s without intervention," Margaret replied. "And certainly not postmenopausal. This pregnancy is a medical anomaly, Richard. It's dangerous. We'll get the best care, he insisted again. Whatever it takes. Margaret shook her head, exhausted by his refusal to see reason. And after? What then? I'll be 60 when this baby is born. You'll be… what? Playing both father and son? Living a lie every day? Not a lie, Richard said stubbornly. A new truth. Our truth. The conviction in his voice chilled Margaret. He truly believed what he was saying, that they could create some new reality where their relationship wasn't perverted, where this pregnancy wasn't a biological aberration. I'm tired, she said, standing up from the table. I'm going to bed. Richard rose as well. I'll clean up. You rest. The solicitude in his voice, the care he was showing, it was all directed at the pregnancy, not at her. Margaret realized with a sickening clarity that she had become merely a vessel to him, a means to the end he desired. In her bedroom, Margaret closed the door, then quietly turned the lock. It wouldn't keep Richard out if he was determined to enter. The old locks in the farmhouse were flimsy, but it was a small assertion of boundaries. She changed into her nightgown and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her hand drifted to her still flat abdomen. Somewhere inside, impossibly, cells were dividing, forming what could become a child. Her child, Richard's child. The wrongness of it twisted in her gut. Sleep evaded her. Hours passed, marked by the ticking of the bedside clock and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Around midnight, she heard Richard's footsteps in the hallway, pausing outside her door. The doorknob turned slightly, testing, then stopped at the resistance of the lock. A moment later, his footsteps retreated to his own room. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something had fundamentally changed between them. The trust that had once existed, complicated as it had become by their physical relationship, was now completely shattered. In its place was fear, her fear of him, and his fear of losing control of her. As the night deepened, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't stay. Richard would never accept her choice about the pregnancy, would never let her go willingly. She would have to escape. The question was how. Richard would be watching her closely now, especially with her appointment looming. The truck keys were kept in the kitchen, and he would notice if they went missing. The nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, was 5 miles away, a long walk across open country that Richard would spot immediately from the fields. The landline in the kitchen could be monitored, and her cell phone's reception was spotty at best out here. Joe was coming to help with the harvest next week, Richard's unwitting accomplice in keeping her contained. But maybe Joe could also be her opportunity, if she could get him alone, explain her situation. But what would she say? That the man he knew as her adopted son was actually the father of her unborn child. The shame of that confession burned in her throat. No, she would need another way. Dr. Winters had given her contact information for a women's shelter. Information, now reduced to ashes in the wood stove. But Margaret remembered the name of the organization. If she could get to a phone, make a call without Richard overhearing. A plan began to form in her mind. Not perfect, fraught with risks, but a plan nonetheless. She would need to be careful to bide her time, to pretend compliance while looking for her opportunity. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside her window, Margaret finally drifted into an exhausted sleep. In her dreams, she was running across the endless Nebraska plains. A shadowy figure always just behind her, always gaining ground no matter how fast she fled. Joe Harper arrived on a Tuesday morning, his battered pickup raising a cloud of dust as it rattled up the driveway. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Richard went out to greet him, the two men shaking hands, laughing, slapping each other on the back with the easy camaraderie of long acquaintance. Joe had been helping with their harvest for 5 years now, ever since his own farm had failed and he'd turned to seasonal work to make ends meet. He was in his 50s, a widower with grown children, quiet but kind. Under normal circumstances, Margaret would have been pleased to see him. Now she regarded his arrival with mingled hope and apprehension. Richard led Joe into the house, both men stomping their boots on the porch to knock off the dust. "Look who's here, Ma," Richard called, his voice unnaturally cheerful. Joe's arrived just in time for the big push. Margaret forced a smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "Nice to see you, Joe. You're looking well." Joe nodded, shy as always. "Miss Henderson, thanks for putting me up this year. Appreciate not having to drive back and forth from that motel. Call me Margaret. Please," she insisted, as she did every year. "And it's no trouble. The guest room's all made up for you." Richard's eyes never left Margaret as this exchange took place, monitoring her every word, her every expression. The performance they were both putting on, the normal, hospitable farm owners welcoming a seasonal helper, felt grotesque in light of what was really happening. "I made lunch," Margaret said, gesturing to the sandwiches on the counter. "You boys must be hungry." "Starving," Richard agreed, still with that false cheer. "Joe, drop your bags in the guest room and join us. First door on the right upstairs." As Joe hefted his duffel bag and headed for the stairs, Richard stepped closer to Margaret. "Looking good, Ma," he murmured. his voice low so Joe wouldn't overhear. Very convincing. The threat implicit in his words was clear. Keep up the act or else. Margaret turned away, busying herself with pouring iced tea, fighting to keep her hands steady. Lunch was an exercise in restraint. Richard dominated the conversation, discussing crop yields, equipment needs, weather forecasts. Joe responded with his usual taciturn comments, while Margaret pushed food around her plate, her appetite non-existent. The nausea that had plagued her for weeks was especially bad today, though whether from morning sickness or anxiety, she couldn't tell. Margaret's not feeling well lately, Richard explained when Joe noticed her picking at her food. A stomach bug, we think. The casual lie, the way he spoke for her, sent a surge of anger through Margaret. Actually, she said, looking directly at Joe, I haven't been myself at all recently. Very constrained. Joe looked confused by her choice of words, but Richard's jaw tightened. Maybe you should lie down after lunch, he suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. I'll show Joe what needs doing in the north field. I think I will rest, Margaret agreed, seeing an opportunity. With both men out in the distant field, she might have a chance to use the phone unmonitored. You two go ahead. I'll clean up here. Richard hesitated, clearly calculating whether it was safe to leave her alone. Don't overdo it, he finally said. Doctor said you need your rest. Another lie. The doctor had said no such thing, but Joe nodded sympathetically, accepting Richard's fiction without question. After lunch, Margaret washed dishes slowly, watching through the window until Richard and Joe disappeared over the rise toward the north field. Only when they were completely out of sight did she move to the old rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Her hands trembled as she dialed information, asking for the number of the women's shelter in Lincoln. When the operator connected her, Margaret spoke quickly, her voice hushed despite knowing the men were far away. My name is Margaret Henderson, she began when a woman answered. I'm calling because I need help leaving an unsafe situation. The woman on the other end, who identified herself as Diane, responded with calm professionalism, asking Margaret to explain her circumstances. With halting words, Margaret outlined her situation, omitting the most shameful details about her relationship with Richard, focusing instead on his controlling behavior, his refusal to allow her to terminate her pregnancy, his isolation tactics. I'm concerned for your immediate safety, Diane said when Margaret finished. Is there someone who can come get you today? A friend or family member? No, Margaret admitted. I don't have anyone. That's why I need your help. We can arrange transportation, Diane assured her, but it would be best if you could meet our volunteer at a public location, not at your home. This was the problem Margaret had been wrestling with. The nearest town is 15 miles away, and I don't have access to a vehicle without his knowledge. There was a pause as Diane considered this. Is there a neighbor who might help? Someone within walking distance? The closest is 5 miles across open fields, Margaret explained. He would see me leaving. I understand, Diane said, her voice reflecting the seriousness of the situation. In cases of extreme isolation like this, we sometimes work with local law enforcement. Would you be comfortable with a sheriff's deputy coming to escort you out? The thought of official involvement, of the inevitable questions, the potential publicity in their small community, made Margaret hesitate. I'm not sure. That would escalate things significantly. Margaret, Diane said gently, from what you've described, this situation is already escalated. Your safety is the priority now. Before Margaret could respond, she heard the distant sound of the screen door slamming. Panic seized her. Someone's coming, she whispered into the phone. I have to go. Wait, Diane said urgently. Take this number down. Call back when you can. If you're in immediate danger, call 911. Margaret quickly memorized the number Diane recited, then hung up just as footsteps sounded on the porch. She moved swiftly to the sink, resuming her dishwashing as the door opened. It was Joe, not Richard, who entered. Sorry to disturb you, Miss Henderson. Margaret, he corrected himself. Richard asked me to get the extra work gloves from the mudroom. Margaret nodded, relief washing through her that it wasn't Richard, followed immediately by a new anxiety. Had Joe heard any of her conversation? His expression gave nothing away as he rummaged in the mudroom closet. Found him, he said, holding up a pair of leather work gloves. He turned to leave, then paused, looking at Margaret with an odd expression. Everything all right? You seem ... tense. The unexpected question, the hint of concern in Joe's voice, nearly broke Margaret's composure. Here was a potential ally if she dared to trust him. But the risk was enormous. If Joe didn't believe her, if he reported her behavior to Richard ... I'm fine, she said, forcing a smile. Just tired. Like Richard said, I haven't been well. Joe studied her face a moment longer, then nodded. You know, he said casually, my sister went through a rough patch a few years back. Had to stay at that women's place in Lincoln for a while. Safe Harbor, I think it was called. Did her a world of good. Margaret froze, the dish in her hands dripping suds onto the floor. Had he heard after all? Was this a veiled offer of help? Or was it just an innocent comment, a bit of personal sharing from the usually reticent man? Before she could decide how to respond, Joe continued, "Anyway, better get back before Richard wonders what's taking so long. You take care now, Margaret." He left, the screen door banging behind him, leaving Margaret standing at the sink, heart pounding. Safe Harbor. That was the name of the shelter she had just called. It couldn't be a coincidence. Joe had heard something, maybe not everything, but enough to make this oblique reference. The question was, what would he do with what he had heard? Go straight to Richard? Or might he be willing to help her? She had always liked Joe, had sensed a fundamental decency in him, but they weren't close. He had worked for them, eaten at their table, but they had never shared confidences or built the kind of trust that would make her comfortable revealing her desperate situation. Margaret dried her hands on her apron, mind racing. If Joe did tell Richard about the call, her situation would become even more precarious. Richard might remove the phone entirely, might never let her out of his sight. She needed to act quickly before that happened. She went to her bedroom and quickly packed a small bag, a change of clothes, her identification, what little cash she kept in her dresser drawer. She hid the bag under her bed, ready if an opportunity for escape presented itself. The afternoon dragged on interminably. Margaret moved through her chores mechanically, all while listening for the men's return, watching the clock, considering and discarding possible plans. She could try to walk to the Jamisons' farm overnight, but 5 miles across dark fields at her age and her condition seemed nearly impossible. She could confront Richard directly, threaten to call the sheriff if he didn't let her go, but that might provoke violence she wasn't prepared for. The sun began to set. She heard the men returning, their voices carrying across the yard. Dinner would be expected, the normal routine of the household maintained despite the terrible tension underlying it all. Margaret was setting the table when they entered, mud-stained and weary from the day's labor. Richard immediately came to her side, his presence both territorial and monitoring. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice solicitous, his eyes watchful. "Get some rest like I suggested?" "Some," Margaret replied, not meeting his gaze. "Dinner's almost ready." Joe excused himself to wash up, leaving them momentarily alone. Richard leaned closer. "What did you do this afternoon?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Margaret's heart skipped. Did he know? Had Joe said something after all? "Laundry," she lied. "Rested. The usual." Richard's eyes flickered to the phone on the wall, then back to her face. "No calls? No visitors?" "Who would call?" Margaret countered, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Who would visit out here?" For a long moment Richard studied her face, searching for signs of deception. Then Joe returned, breaking the tension, and Richard stepped away. Dinner was a repeat of lunch. Richard dominating the conversation, Margaret quiet, Joe observing more than participating. But there was a new undercurrent now, a sense of watchfulness from all three participants. Margaret stole occasional glances at Joe, looking for any sign that he intended to help or hinder her, but his weathered face remained impassive. After the meal, Richard suggested they all sit in the living room, an unusual proposal that Margaret recognized immediately as a strategy to keep her under observation. They watched an old Western on television, Margaret barely seeing the screen, her mind consumed with escape plans, with fear, with desperate hope that somehow she would find a way out. When she finally excused herself for bed, Richard followed her to the stairs. "Sleep well, Ma," he said, loud enough for Joe to hear. Then, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I'll be listening. Don't try anything stupid." In her room, Margaret again locked the door, though she knew it was a futile gesture against Richard's determination. She lay fully clothed on top of her bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house, the television still playing downstairs, the occasional creak of a floorboard as someone moved, the wind rattling the old window frames. Hours passed. The television went silent. Footsteps on the stairs, 2 sets, Richard and Joe both turning in for the night. Doors closing. Silence descending. Margaret waited, counting minutes, then hours. When the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2, she rose quietly, retrieving her hidden bag from beneath the bed. She moved to her door, unlocking it with exquisite care to avoid any sound, then eased it open a crack. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through the window at the end. Richard's room was opposite hers, Joe's further down. Both doors were closed. Margaret stepped into the hallway, wincing as a floorboard creaked beneath her weight. She froze, listening. No sound of movement from either room. Heartened, she continued toward the stairs, each step measured and careful. She had nearly reached the top of the staircase when a door opened behind her. Margaret turned, expecting to see Richard's angry face, already preparing excuses about getting a glass of water. Instead, Joe stood in the doorway of the guest room, fully dressed. He looked at Margaret at the bag in her hand and nodded once. "I'll drive you," he said simply. Joe's truck rumbled down the long driveway, headlights off to avoid alerting Richard. Margaret sat rigid in the passenger seat, her small bag clutched in her lap, eyes fixed on the farmhouse receding behind them. She half expected to see lights flare to life, to hear Richard's shouts, to see his figure running after them in the moonlight. But the house remained dark and still, its silhouette growing smaller until it disappeared entirely as they crested the hill. Only when the farmhouse was completely out of sight did Joe switch on the headlights, illuminating the narrow dirt road that led to the highway. Neither of them had spoken since their brief exchange in the hallway. The silence between them was charged with questions, with unspoken acknowledgments of the strangeness of their situation. "I heard your call," Joe finally said, his eyes never leaving the road. "Not all of it. Enough." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "I thought you might have. Never like to get involved in other folks' business," Joe continued, his weathered hands steady on the wheel. "But some things you can't just look away from." "Thank you," Margaret said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of what he was doing for her. "I didn't know how I was going to get away." Joe was quiet for another mile before speaking again. "Known Richard a long time. Always seemed like a good man. Hard worker, respectful. But there was something, I don't know. Something not right between you two. This harvest more than ever." Margaret said nothing. She couldn't bring herself to explain the full truth, the shameful reality of what had developed between her and Richard. Let Joe think it was just control, just possessiveness. That was bad enough. "Where to?" Joe asked as they approached the highway. "That place in Lincoln, Safe Harbor?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "But he'll know that's where I'd go. It might be the first place he looks." Joe considered this, then nodded. "My sister's place is in Omaha. It's further, but maybe safer. She's a nurse. Good people." The offer, unexpected, generous beyond measure, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I couldn't impose, not imposing," Joe interrupted. "She'd want to help." "That's the kind of person she is." Margaret hesitated. She had planned to go to the shelter to get professional support, perhaps legal advice. But Joe was right, it might be the first place Richard would look, and the thought of a private home of anonymity was appealing. "All right," she said finally. "Omaha, if your sister wouldn't mind." Joe nodded, flipping on his turn signal to head east toward Omaha rather than north toward Lincoln. "She won't mind," he assured her, "and Richard won't think to look there." They drove in silence for a while, the dark Nebraska landscape rolling by outside the windows, fields and occasional farmhouses all slumbering under the night sky. Margaret felt a surreal detachment, as though she were watching herself from a distance, this older woman fleeing in the night, leaving behind the only home she'd known for decades. "He'll be angry with you," she said eventually. "For helping me." Joe shrugged. "Let him be. I'll be moving on after harvest anyway." "Always do." "He might not pay you for your work," Margaret warned. "Some things matter more than money," Joe replied simply. The straightforwardness of his morality, the uncomplicated decency of this man she barely knew, made Margaret's throat tighten with emotion. It contrasted so sharply with the twisted relationship she had developed with Richard, with the complex web of dependency, guilt, and inappropriate desire that had ensnared them both. "There's something you should know," she said after another stretch of silence, "about why I'm leaving, about the situation with Richard." Joe raised a hand from the steering wheel. "No need to explain. Not my business." "You're driving me across the state in the middle of the night," Margaret pointed out. "I think that makes it at least a little bit your business." Joe considered this, then nodded. "All right, if you want to talk, I'll listen." Margaret took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. She couldn't tell him everything, the shame was too great, but she owed him some explanation. "I'm pregnant," she began, the words still bizarre to her own ears. "At 59, it shouldn't be possible, but it is." The doctor confirmed it. Joe's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "Richards?" he asked after a moment. Margaret nodded, unable to speak the confirmation aloud. Joe absorbed this information silently, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. "And, he doesn't want you to take care of it," he said finally. "He wants me to have it regardless of the risks to my health." "Regardless of everything," Margaret confirmed. "He won't let me make my own choice." "Not his decision to make," Joe said simply. The straightforward statement, the absolute certainty with which Joe declared her bodily autonomy, made Margaret's eyes fill with tears again. After weeks of Richard's manipulation, of his insistence that his desires trumped hers, the simple acknowledgement that the choice was hers alone felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Thank you," she whispered. Joe didn't respond verbally, just nodded again, eyes on the road. They fell back into silence, more comfortable now, as the miles rolled by beneath the truck's wheels. Margaret watched the clock on the dashboard tick past 3, then 4 in the morning. She should have been exhausted, but adrenaline kept her alert, her mind racing with thoughts of what Richard would do when he discovered her gone. "He'll come looking," she said, voicing the fear that had been building. "He won't just let me go." "Probably not," Joe agreed. "But Omaha's a big place. And Lauren, my sister, she knows how to be discreet. Worked with domestic cases at the hospital for years. I should call the shelter," Margaret said, remembering her promise to Diane. "Let them know I'm safe, at least for now. They might report me missing otherwise." Joe nodded. "There's a rest stop about 20 miles ahead. Phone booth there. Should be safe enough." The sky was beginning to lighten, the black giving way to deep blue by the time they reached the rest stop. It was deserted at this early hour, just a couple of semi-trucks in the oversized parking spaces, their drivers presumably sleeping in their cabs. Joe pulled up beside the phone booth, keeping the engine running. "Want me to come with you?" Margaret shook her head. "I'll be quick." The phone booth was a relic, the kind that was increasingly rare in the age of cell phones. Margaret fed quarters into the slot and dialed the number she had memorized from Diane. Despite the early hour, someone answered on the second ring. "Safe Harbor. This is Melissa speaking." "This is Margaret Henderson," she said, her voice low despite the emptiness of the rest stop. "I spoke with Diane earlier. I just wanted to let you know I'm safe. I got away." There was a pause, then. "Thank you for calling, Margaret. We were concerned when your call ended so abruptly." "Are you somewhere secure?" "Yes, for now. A friend is helping me. I'm going to stay with his sister in Omaha for a bit while I figure things out. Do you have medical support there?" "Diane mentioned your pregnancy. His sister is a nurse," Margaret explained. "She works with cases like mine, apparently." "That's good," Melissa said, sounding relieved. "But please remember we're here if you need us. Legal advocacy, counseling, whatever support you require." "Thank you," Margaret said sincerely. "I may need that help soon, especially when he comes looking for me." "Do you want to file a police report?" Melissa asked. "We can help facilitate that." Margaret hesitated. The thought of involving law enforcement, of making the whole sordid situation a matter of public record, still filled her with dread. "Not yet," she decided. "Let me get settled first. Think things through." "Of course," Melissa assured her. "This is your process, your timeline. We're just here to support, not to push." After promising to call again in a few days, Margaret hung up and returned to the truck. Joe was sipping from a thermos of coffee, another cup waiting for her on the dashboard. "Everything okay?" he asked as she settled back into the passenger seat. Margaret nodded, taking the offered coffee gratefully. "They were glad to hear I'm safe." Joe put the truck in gear, pulling back onto the highway. "About 2 more hours to Omaha," he said. "Try to rest if you can. Been a long night." The adrenaline that had kept Margaret alert was indeed beginning to wane. The coffee helped, but the emotional and physical toll of the past weeks, culminating in this nighttime escape, was catching up with her. She leaned her head against the window, watching the Nebraska landscape transform with the dawn, fields gilded with early sunlight, farmhouses coming to life with lights in kitchens and barns. "What will you tell Richard?" she asked suddenly, realizing that Joe would have to return to the farm, would have to face Richard's rage when he discovered them both gone. "The truth," Joe said simply, "that you needed to leave, and I helped you. That you're safe, but I won't tell him where." "He might get violent," Margaret warned. "When he's angry. I've seen it. Not often, but it's there under the surface." Joe's weathered face remained impassive. "I can handle myself," he said. "Been in worse spots, and I won't be sticking around long." Margaret wanted to protest further, to warn him more explicitly about Richard's potential for violence, but exhaustion was overtaking her. Her eyelids grew heavy, the rhythm of the truck on the highway lulling her toward sleep. The last thing she saw before drifting off was the rising sun turning the eastern sky a brilliant orange, the color of hope, of new beginnings. Lauren Harper's home was a modest one-story house on the outskirts of Omaha, set back from the street and partially hidden by mature oak trees. A small garden bloomed with late autumn flowers, asters and chrysanthemums, adding color to the otherwise unremarkable property. It looked, Margaret thought, as Joe's truck pulled into the driveway, like the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. The perfect sanctuary. Joe had called ahead from a gas station payphone, briefly explaining the situation to his sister. Now, as they approached the front door, it opened to reveal a woman in her early 50s with Joe's same steady gaze and practical demeanor. She wore scrubs, having just returned from a night shift at the hospital. "You must be Margaret," Lauren said, extending her hand. "Come in, both of you. You look exhausted." The interior of the house matched its exterior, modest, neat, without pretension. Family photos lined the hallway, showing Lauren with what appeared to be grown children, Joe at various family gatherings, an older couple who must have been their parents. "Coffee's fresh," Lauren said, leading them to a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. "And I picked up some pastries on the way home. Figured you might be hungry after that drive." Margaret accepted the offered coffee and pastry, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since dinner the previous evening, and the pregnancy, impossible as it still seemed, was demanding nourishment. "Joe told me a bit about your situation," Lauren said, settling across the table from Margaret. "Just the basics. That you needed to get away from someone controlling. That you're pregnant and being pressured about it." Margaret nodded, grateful that Joe had been discreet about the details. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this." Lauren waved away the apology. "No imposition. Joe knows I've got room, and I've helped women in difficult situations before. Part of my job. Lauren works in obstetrics," Joe explained. "Specializes in higher-risk cases." "Higher risk," Margaret repeated, the term resonating with her situation in more ways than one. "That would be me, in every sense." Lauren's gaze was clinical but kind as it assessed Margaret. "Joe mentioned your age. 59, right? And pregnant." Margaret nodded, still finding it surreal to discuss this impossibility as fact. "About 7 weeks, according to the doctor in Lincoln." She said it was ... extremely unusual. "It is," Lauren agreed. "But not unprecedented. There are documented cases, though they're rare enough to make medical journals." The matter-of-fact way she discussed it, without judgment or disbelief, eased some of the tension Margaret had been carrying. Here was someone who understood the medical realities, who wouldn't question the truth of her situation. "The doctor said there are significant risks," Margaret continued. "For me and for the fetus." She still couldn't bring herself to say baby, still needed the clinical distance. Lauren nodded. "There would be. Hypertension, gestational diabetes, placental issues, greater risk of genetic abnormalities. But we can monitor all of that closely, if ... double quotes." She paused. "If you decide to continue the pregnancy." The careful phrasing, the acknowledgement of choice that had been so absent in Richard's demands brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "I don't want to continue it," she admitted, the words both a relief and a weight. "I made an appointment in Lincoln, but he found out. He wouldn't let me go. That's why I had to leave." Lauren reached across the table, briefly touching Margaret's hand. "Then we'll get you the care you need. On your terms." Joe, who had been quiet during this exchange, stood up. "I should get going. Long drive back." Alarm flashed through Margaret. "Richard'll be awake by now. He'll know we're both gone." "Let him know," Joe said with a shrug. "I'll tell him I helped you leave. That you're safe, but I don't know where. It'll be the truth." "Joe," Margaret began, the fear for his safety evident in her voice. "I'll be fine," he assured her. "I'll get my things and go." No need to confront him at all. Lauren looked between them, concern creasing her brow. "Is this man dangerous, Margaret? Should we be worried about him finding you here?" Margaret hesitated. Was Richard dangerous? The controlling behavior, the anger, the possessiveness, these were all warning signs. But would he actually hurt someone? The Richard she had raised wouldn't have. The Richard of the past months, though, him she wasn't sure about. "I don't think he would hurt anyone physically," she said slowly. "But he's determined, and he considers this pregnancy his right to control." Lauren's expression hardened.